Hello everybody, this is Sun Random Neko, waking up from her nap to greet the world for the day. And by greet, I mean finally present to you all the promised Part 2 rewrite video that I spoke about in my Disney's live-action Snow White review. FYI, this video will not be what I think a live-action Snow White film should look like, but instead is my take on how the film could have gone if Disney actually tried instead of making the film with an everything's fine mentality while dumping a crap ton of money into the fire without a second thought. So basically, I'll be manipulating and reworking the story beats and elements already introduced and used in the official film to hopefully tell a better story. Anyways, that's enough procrastinating now, so let's begin. We start with Snow White's fairy tale book, which opens to the first page as Jonathan narrates in the classic Once Upon a Time in a Land Far, Far Away style. The page transitions into real life as we watch a king and queen stroll through the streets of a kingdom that's vibrant, colorful, and full of life. The people happily greet them as they go about their day, and help anyone in need, such as a young man helping an old woman carry some heavy bags, or a merchant consoling a crying man with some flowers, and so on. The king and queen see the baker give small treats to a group of children, who gleefully thank him before running over to greet the royal couple. The queen sees crumbs stuck to a little girl's face, and gently wipes it off. The girl thanks her before joining the other children in running off to their next adventure. The king and queen watch them go with wistful expressions. One day, they think to themselves as they hold each other close, one day they'll also have a child to love and care for. Soon enough, on the day of winter's first snow, the queen gives birth to a healthy and beautiful baby girl. The king and queen walk out onto a balcony that faces a large and beautiful garden with a well sitting at its center. A single snowflake drifts down from the sky and lands on the baby girl's nose, sending her into a giggling fit that delights the king and queen. And so, in honor of the day she was born, they name her Snow White. Jonathan's narration concludes as we jump ahead in time and see an 8-year-old Snow White in a vast apple orchard with her parents and many of the kingdom's people picking apples for the harvest festival. Everyone begins to sing Good Things Grow, which has been modified to not include the well scene, and we transition to Snow White walking through the streets of the kingdom as festival preparations are underway. During the song, we see her doing small acts of kindness, like helping to catch a basket full of gems about to fall from someone's hands, giving a flower to a man who gives it to his delighted girlfriend, and more, while the king and queen watch on with glowing pride. The song fades as we switch over to Snow White's perspective as she's having fun weaving flower crowns and joking around with other children. Something appears in the corner of her eye, catching her attention, and she looks over to see it's a young boy who's waving for her to come over. Snow White smiles widely at the sight of him and places her completed flower crown on a smiling girl's head before going over. She greets the boy, who turns out to be a young Jonathan. He has something he wants to give her, but not here. The two then spirit themselves away to the castle, making their way into the garden from the beginning that's still beautiful after all these years, and now has an apple tree growing besides the well in the center. Snow White and Jonathan walk to the tree, making small talk about the festival and all the dishes made from the harvest they couldn't wait to eat. When they come to a stop under the apple tree, Jonathan takes out a necklace and presents it to Snow White. She asks what the necklace is for, and he says it's his first piece that he managed to complete. With a little help from his father, he mumbles under his breath. Snow White giggles and looks closely at the necklace, seeing there's an inscription engraved on it that says, "Kind, brave, and true." She asks what it means, and Jonathan says he wrote it because that's the sort of queen he knows she'll one day be. She's really touched by the faith he has in her, and says she'll happily accept the necklace, but only if he promises that they'll still be best friends even when she becomes queen and he a blacksmith. Jonathan's about to do just that when he spots a ripe red apple nearby and he plucks it from its branch. He holds it out to her and solemnly swears on the apple that he will always be her best friend and never forget her. He then bites into the apple and she beams at him, finally taking the necklace. She fastens it around her neck and asks how it looks on her, and he replies that it looks perfect. The two smile at each other as they bask in the moment, only for it to be interrupted by the other children that they left behind, pouring into the garden and complaining about how they were taking forever and they'll have no time to bake the pies if they don't start now. Snow White and Jonathan share a laugh before they run out of the garden with the other children, and the apple is left behind on the edge of the well. Good Things Grow picks back up as we see them baking pies in the kitchen with the help of the kitchen staff, before bringing them out for everyone to enjoy. The celebration ends and the song fades as the king, queen, and Snow White stand before the well looking down at the watery image of a happy family. Jonathan's narration begins again as we see the image of the queen fade away, leaving a grieving king and Snow White clinging to each other in comfort. Then we're in the throne room, where the evil queen appears and the king is immediately enchanted by her beauty, while Snow White is more cautious and uncertain. The evil queen approaches Snow White and kneels down before her. With a wave of her hand, a rose appears. Snow White gasps in delight and accepts the offered rose with a smile. Before long, the king and evil queen are wed, and the kingdom celebrates as it seems that the wound in their king and princess's heart, made by the absence of the queen, has finally begun to heal. However, news soon reaches the kingdom of a threat from the south, with plans to invade and raze their land until there's nothing left but ash. The king rallies the army and they leave the very next day, but not before he promises to return to Snow White no matter what. Unfortunately, his promise wouldn't be kept, and news of his death arrived with the army's return from extinguishing the threat of the south. The entire kingdom mourned, not yet knowing that they lost the last monarch of a peaceful era, but they would soon learn as the evil queen took the throne and finally revealed her true colors. She ordered for all the kingdom's gems and gold to be seized and stored in her private treasury, and for all able-bodied men, regardless of occupation, to become soldiers of her army. The people could only watch in horror as the very life seemed to bleed from the land, turning it into a gloomy landscape. However, there was still one last remaining tie to the old kingdom, Snow White. Instead of killing the young girl, the evil queen decided that there could be a use for her yet in the future, so she put Snow White to work as a scullery maid and moved her into the inner court of the castle where she would be isolated from everyone and everything she knew. When all was said and done, when the evil queen's grip on the kingdom was absolute, she would stand before her mirror, the source of all her magic power, and ask a fateful question. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all? You are my queen. You are the fairest of them all, the mirror answered. The evil queen smiled as the magic within her grew as a result. And so time marched on, unforgiving and unrelenting. The evil queen grew more powerful, the kingdom grew more destitute, and poor Snow White would soon be forgotten by the people. She would even begin to forget herself. The only things she would remember of her life from before were the warm embrace of her parents and a promise made on a necklace and an apple. 10 years later, Jonathan, now grown into a handsome young man with a rebellious spirit and a desire to protect the kingdom that had once been full of life, looks out at the town with an expression that hardens when he sees a pair of children, a boy and a girl, rummaging through a meager pile of garbage for any scraps of food to eat. He's reminded of a promise from long ago, one he remembers was made on an apple, but cannot quite remember who it was made with, and his hard expression becomes one of determination as he turns his gaze towards the castle that still gleams with opulence against the desolate backdrop. We then cut to Snow White sweeping away with only squirrels, birds, and rabbits for company. Her sweeping soon brings her to the garden, which has wilted from neglect over the years. The well is covered in ivy and weeds, and the apple tree still stands, but its branches are barren, except for a single apple that hangs on a branch closest to the well. Snow White sees that apple as she approaches, and reaches out to pick it. Just before she touches it, she pulls her hand back, afraid of plucking what could possibly be the last apple this tree will ever grow. She then sings her I Want song, waiting on a wish, and dances around the garden as it comes back to life, and the blurry figures of the kingdom's people appear to join her in dancing merrily, just as they did 10 years ago. As the song swells, the king and queen appear, holding each other close as they dance along with the crowd, but their faces are blurry as Snow White can no longer remember what they look like anymore. The song slowly comes to an end with the people fading first, then the life in the garden, and finally the king and queen, until Snow White is once again alone in the barren garden. She looks down the well and clutches her necklace like a lifeline. Just then, she hears a sound and turns to see Jonathan carrying a sack over his shoulder while trying to look as inconspicuous as possible. "Who are you?" she calls out, making him stop in his tracks and look at her like a deer caught in the crosshairs. He quickly smooths his expression into something suave and grins charmingly at her, saying that he's the garbage boy taking out the garbage for the day. Snow White doesn't buy it and asks if he's stealing. He responds with a "no" that sounds more like a question than an answer. She looks unimpressed and tells him to give her one good reason why she shouldn't call for the guards. He gives her a cocky grin and says because he's devilishly handsome. Now she's even more unimpressed and opens her mouth to shout. He runs over to cover her mouth before she can, going, okay, none of that now." She glares and starts whacking him with her broom, forcing him to back off. She continues to whack him until he begs for mercy and says he'll tell the truth, just don't call for the guards. "You swear?" she asks, no longer whacking, but still pointing the broom threateningly at him. He nods frantically. She lowers her broom and asks why he's stealing. "Well, it's not so much stealing as it is a redistribution of supplies," he retorts, as this little sack, which he lifts in emphasis, didn't even make a dent to the castle stores, but is enough to feed a few families for a whole week. Snow White is shocked. Why doesn't he go to the queen and let her know there were families going hungry? Jonathan laughs in disbelief. What made her think the queen would deign to listen to one of the very people she was starving? Better yet, why not ask him to speak with the princess, who might as well have died with their king considering no one's seen or heard from her in 10 years? Snow White is taken aback by his bitter resentment, and he apologizes for his tone. She says it's fine and asks if the kingdom has really fallen into such a poor state. Jonathan looks at her in disbelief, like how can she not know? She weakly remarks that she hasn't once left the castle walls in 10 years. "Oh," is the brilliant response he gives. There's a bit of an awkward silence until Jonathan asks if she'd like to leave and see the kingdom again, to which she says she'd love to, but she doesn't know if she would even be allowed to leave. This puzzles him, like why wouldn't a scullery maid be allowed to leave? But he doesn't voice that thought, instead persuading her that he can sneak her in and out without anyone ever knowing. She eventually agrees and he tells her to meet him back here once night has fallen, and pieces out before any guards can cotton on to his presence within the castle grounds. Snow White watches him disappear, and then goes back to the well where she looks down at the water's surface again. Suddenly, a flower lands on the water, and she looks up to see that a few flowers are beginning to bloom on the apple tree's branches. Her expression becomes hopeful as she looks at the lone apple. Without hesitation this time, she plucks it before scurrying off to complete her chores. In the evening, the evil queen calls for Snow White to join her for dinner. There's a feast laid out, and Snow White asks what the occasion is. "It's to celebrate her 18th birthday, of course," the evil queen replies. Snow White thanks her, though she also mentions that her birthday was a few months ago. The evil queen just waves her off, playing up the "I'm so busy ruling the kingdom I forgot" angle, and Snow White quietly accepts the excuse. They eat dinner in silence for a bit, until Snow White carefully brings up the food shortage Jonathan spoke about. The evil queen asks where she heard that, and she says she heard it in passing while cleaning by the edges of the inner court. The evil queen scoffs and asks how there could be a food shortage if she's able to eat so well every day, waving a hand at the lavish feast as if it was proof enough of her claims. But instead of dropping it, Snow White pushes a little, suggesting that it wouldn't hurt to share some of their food with the people. After all, they shared all the time when her father ruled, because the bounty of the land was created to be shared with each other, like how they used to bake apple pies for everyone to enjoy. The evil queen interrupts her, scolding her for having a naive mindset that wouldn't be able to protect the kingdom, that the people don't need apple pies, but unyielding strength. She creates a diamond and compliments it for being eternal and beautiful, knocking against the table and going, "See? No scratch." Then she changes the diamond into a rose and whacks it against the table, making Snow White jump. She holds up the broken and wilted rose and lets it dissipate into ash. "Don't forget that it was because the kingdom was so weak that the king died," the evil queen says, before dismissing Snow White, who thanks her for the meal before speed walking out of the room. The evil queen smirks before resuming her meal. Snow White returns to the garden close to tears and clutching at her necklace. Not a moment later, Jonathan pops up, announcing his presence with a cheery, "Hello, dear maiden," and she hastily wipes her eyes before turning to face him. His smile immediately drops, and he asks her what's wrong. She says there's nothing wrong. It's just that she isn't sure if she wants to leave anymore, that maybe she should just stay here after all. Jonathan's frown deepens, and he presses like, "Hey, no, really, what happened in the few hours I was gone?" After a beat of silence, Snow White admits she spoke with the queen, which surprises him. "And you're still standing here? Who are you?" he asks. "I'm nobody," she says. "Nobody at all." He insists that that can't be true, but she asks for him to drop it, so he does. "But about that trip to town," he says, switching gears, "I really think you should go." Snow White begins to protest, but the queen said, "Hey," he interrupts her, "in and out, remember? And I really think you need to see what's become of the kingdom these last 10 years. They have a moment where they gaze at each other as if staring into the other's soul. After a beat, Snow White agrees and the two sneak out. The pair arrive in town, and it's exactly as Jonathan says. Desolate and dreary, a complete 180 from how it was when Snow White was a child. She asks what happened, and he solemnly says, "The queen happened." As they walk around, taking in the sights of broken down buildings and impoverished people, they hear an angry voice shouting for someone to stop. They turn around to see a child running away from a group of angry men. Snow White intervenes by cutting them off and demanding to know what they're chasing a child for. The lead man accuses the child of stealing a loaf of bread from his store. Snow White is indignant. Surely the man could spare one loaf of bread, as the child was clearly starving. But the man retorts that they're all starving, and you don't see him stealing from others. Then she tries to appeal to the man to at least share a piece of the bread instead. But the man laughs derisively. No one shared anything since the king died, after all. Jonathan tries to intervene, but Snow White doesn't back down, saying that it's not too late to share again, and she pulls out the apple from the garden. She asks for a knife so that the men and the child could each have a piece. Even if it won't fill their bellies, at least it'll be something to eat. Everyone stares at her dumbfounded. The man's expression shifts as if he recognizes something in her, and then he waves at her going, "You know what? Whatever. The child can keep the bread," and he leaves with the rest of the men falling in confusion. Snow White nods as if pleased by what happened, and then turns to offer the apple to the child, who takes it with a toothy grin and shyly thanks her before running off. Jonathan just shakes his head in disbelief, while Snow White watches the child disappear around a corner. "This kind of thing can't continue," she says. "The people are going to die from starvation." "You're preaching to the choir," Jonathan sarcastically remarks. She then declares she'll talk to the queen again and make her listen. He startles like, "Excuse me? What did you say? Because it sounds like you just said something that's a terrible idea." But Snow White's already made up her mind and asks for him to sneak her back into the castle. Jonathan just throws his hands up in defeat and goes, "All right, it's your funeral." He then sneaks her back in, but not before the evil queen catches sight of her doing so. The evil queen frowns and dramatically billows her cloak as she turns away to approach her mirror. "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" she asks. The mirror responds that while the evil queen was still fair of face, Snow White has grown to be much fairer than her and thus was now the fairest of them all. The evil queen gasps as she feels some of her magic leaving her. She looks down at her hands to see a few age spots appear, and she flies into a rage, singing her villain song, "All is Fair," which is modified to be more angry and indignant towards Snow White in a "what does she have that I don't" kind of way. The song ends with her ordering the guards to fetch Snow White. Later in the throne room, Snow White is dragged before the evil queen, and she immediately confronts her about what's happening to the people. But the evil queen again denies everything, claiming that she's only doing what's best for the kingdom, that an army doesn't come cheap. But Snow White argues that what's the point of an army if there's nothing left to protect when all the people starve to death? The evil queen coldly remarks that the people should have tried harder to survive then, and orders the guards to take Snow White away. Snow White vows she'll fight against the evil queen and save her people. The evil queen just ignores her, not finding her vow to be very threatening. However, she is a threat to her magic power, so the evil queen orders a guard to take Snow White into the forest and kill her. She hands him a box and tells him to bring back her heart as proof of her death. The guard accepts the box with a neutral expression, but slightly trembling hands. We cut to that same guard now dragging a tied-up Snow White down a path to the forest. When they reach the edge of the forest, he pulls out a knife and points it at her. Snow White is trembling in fear, but still stands tall and looks him directly in the eyes, not willing to back down even in the face of death. However, when the guard slashes down with his knife, it's not to cut her throat, but instead to cut her free of the ropes. She looks at him in surprise and asks him why. He says that he remembers a time when kindness was still a part of life, and how he couldn't bear to see the last remaining tie to that peaceful and happy time be cut down by the queen's jealousy. He then urges her to run and never return. She hesitates. He starts to yell at her to go, louder and louder, until she finally turns away and runs into the forest. Only once she disappears does he stop. He pulls out the box the evil queen gave him. He then looks over to where he sees a wild boar wander out of the forest, and readies his knife. We then cut to Snow White, who's running through the dark forest, alone and scared. The trees grab at her, and the very wildlife seems to be out to get her. As she runs, the ground suddenly collapses under her, and she goes sliding down a hill all the way into a dark clearing. Just as she gets her bearings, the snap of a twig makes her freeze, as the sound of footsteps get closer and closer and closer until a fawn appears. She lets out an exhale of relief and holds a hand out for the fawn. The fawn cautiously approaches, sniffing her hand before rubbing its head against it. Snow White smiles as she pets the fawn, only to gasp and look around in awe as light fills the clearing, revealing a beautiful grove teeming with life and small woodland critters that approach her in curiosity. The fawn then walks behind her and gently nudges her to stand and move forward. Snow White does so, and she follows the guidance of the animals to a large clearing where a cozy cottage sits. She knocks on the door, but no one answers. The animals push the door open and she follows them, calling out to see if anyone's home, but still no one answers. She looks around and wonders who lives here, while being shocked at the mess inside. "Well, this won't do," she says to herself. She then decides to clean up the cottage with the animals' help, singing "Whistle While You Work" as she tidies everything up until it no longer looks like a disaster zone. At the end of her work, the sun is setting and she finds no harm in laying down for a quick nap on the small beds upstairs. Meanwhile, the 7 dwarves, Doc, Grumpy, Happy, Sleepy, Bashful, Sneezy, and Dopey, are at the mines and singing their work song, Hi Ho, while mining for gems. At the end of the song, the day's work is done and they whistle as they march their way back home. However, when they arrive, They see that everything is clean and spotless and immediately suspect there's an intruder in their home. They search for said intruder and arrive in the bedroom where Snow White is sleeping with some blankets obscuring her from view. The dwarves panic, thinking a monster is sleeping on their beds, but Dopey bravely inches forward to check it out, only for Snow White to awaken at that moment. She screams and he panics, and the dwarves are sent into a tizzy as a result. Eventually, everyone calms down and Snow White introduces herself before apologizing for sleeping on their beds. The dwarves are shocked that the princess is in their home, before quickly composing themselves and introducing themselves to her. They then ask what she's doing here, and she admits that she's running from the evil queen who tried to have her killed. The dwarves are horrified. She then asks if she could shelter with them for a bit until she knows her next steps, but they're conflicted as they don't want to bring the wrath of the evil queen down on them. Snow White understands and asks if they could at least let her stay the night. Again, they're conflicted, until Sneezy asks if she's the one who cleaned their home to be all neat and dust-free, and she says she is. The dwarves then huddle together for a vote. Grumpy wants to kick her out right then and there, but the others are willing to let her stay as thanks for cleaning up. They break the huddle and say she can stay the night. She thanks them and then asks if they would like some dinner. The dwarves, barring Grumpy, enthusiastically agree and go about helping her cook. The day ends with them all sharing a meal together. Later in the night, we jump over to the evil queen who's standing before her mirror again. Mirror, mirror, on the wall, who is the fairest of them all, she asks. You are a beauty most worthy of praise, but so too is Snow White, who holds more beauty and grace than thee. Thus she remains still the fairest of them all, the mirror says. The evil queen is in denial because she was given Snow White's heart in a box. But the mirror holds to its judgment, and the evil queen shrieks in rage as she can feel more of her magic fade. She looks down at her hands again and sees a few wrinkles appear before quickly tucking them into her sleeves. She storms into the throne room where she orders the soldiers to find Snow White and bring her back alive or dead. In the morning, the dwarves wake up to see Snow White has made them a warm and hearty breakfast. Their tune starts to change and they're more willing to let Snow White stay as long as she needs to. But Grumpy still isn't having it, stating that no princess is worth the risk of the evil queen's wrath. The dwarves protest, but Snow White understands Grumpy's point, and doesn't want innocent bystanders to be harmed because of her. The dwarves are sad, but wish her safe travels when she leaves their home. Snow White now wanders to the forest and wonders aloud what her next step should be, only to pause when she hears a familiar voice call out to her. It's Jonathan, who greets her warmly and notes that her appearance in the forest must mean the talk with the queen didn't go so well. Snow White smiles wryly and asks what gave it away. Jonathan just tuts at her, calling her a naive dreamer for thinking that a little talk would actually make the queen have a change of heart. Snow White retorts that at least she tried because words do have power, to which Jonathan rebukes that actions speak louder than words. The two then begin singing princess problems, except it won't be called that as Jonathan doesn't know Snow White is Snow White, as she hasn't introduced herself yet since they reunited. Thus the song is more of a debate between them, with Jonathan subscribing to the school of thought that you gotta do what you gotta do to survive, and Snow White reminding him that kindness is free, and a little bit of it can go a long way and make a lasting impact. The song ends with Snow White asking why he's so cynical, and he says life made him so, that as much as he'd like there to still be kindness, the last 10 years without the king were definitely not kind. Snow White apologizes that he had to go through such harshness. He sighs and shakes his head. She doesn't need to apologize. It's not her fault that the queen is evil and the princess is a ghost. This makes Snow White feel even worse, and she's about to confess that she is the princess, when suddenly they're surrounded by a group of bandits. The bandits demand they hand over all their possessions, to which Jonathan sarcastically retorts that they don't have any. But the bandits don't believe in and brandish their weapons, preparing to strike. It's a very tense moment until Snow White calls for them to wait. The lead bandit asks if she's ready to hand over the goods, but instead she says she recognizes him. She recognizes all of them. The bandits are understandably confused until Snow White starts pointing at each of them, saying their name, what their occupation was, and the acts of kindness they used to do in the kingdom. The bandits are all taken aback, and the lead bandit demands to know how she knows all that. She says that it's because she knew all of them, just like they knew her. Just like they knew her mother and her father. The lead bandit stares at her for a beat, before he gasps in recognition. Snow White? He asks, as if afraid to believe who was standing before his very eyes. She nods and says, yes, I am Snow White. The bandits immediately lower the weapons and murmur amongst each other in astonishment. Meanwhile, Jonathan is staring dumbfounded at her, like, she's the princess. You're the princess. Snow White just smiles sheepishly and says she is. It's then that Jonathan finally notices her necklace and his surprise doubles. However, before anyone can say or do anything, The evil queen's soldiers signal their arrival with an arrow that strikes a tree and abruptly breaks the moment. They all scatter and duck behind a large tree trunk for cover. The lead soldier declares that they're here for Snow White and demands they all come out immediately or else they'll be forced to resort to drastic measures. The lead bandit tells Snow White that she needs to flee, but she refuses to leave them to fight on their own. The lead bandit turns to Jonathan and demands that he get her out of there, to which he easily agrees and drags Snow White away despite her protests. While the bandits delay the guards, Snow White tries to break free from Jonathan's grasp to go help. Jonathan asks her how she's supposed to help in a her and what army kind of way. It's then that the forest wildlife gather around her and she grins, gesturing around her. "This army," she gleefully retorts. Jonathan just sighs and goes, "This really is my life now, helping your princess fight off soldiers with an army of woodland creatures." Snow White then rushes back to where the bandits are, with the animals in tow and Jonathan following closely behind. The bandits are surprised by her reappearance, and grow even more surprised when all sorts of woodland creatures arrive to drive the soldiers back. The entire scene is just chaos as soldiers try to bat away birds and shake off squirrels and rabbits and raccoons and run away from head-butting deer. Eventually, the soldiers retreat, but not before one takes a blind shot at Snow White. Before it can hit her, though, Jonathan steps in and takes the hit instead. For a quick moment, Snow White's mind flashes back to the memory of a boy and an apple, but the boy's face is too blurry to clearly see. Then she screams at the sight of the injured Jonathan and rushes to check if he's okay. He's not, and he's losing blood fast. One of the bandits steps in. She used to be the doctor's apprentice before the doctor was conscripted into the evil queen's army, but she can only do so much to staunch the bleeding. She needs supplies and a place to work, and fast. The bandits all panic, but Snow White knows a place where they can go, and they immediately prepare Jonathan for transport. We fast forward to the group arriving at the dwarves' cottage, where Snow White pleads for them to help save Jonathan. Doc lets them bring Jonathan inside and immediately gets to work helping the doctor's assistant patch his wound. Snow White anxiously waits outside, with the rest of the bandits and dwarves who all try to reassure and comfort her. Eventually, Doc and the doctor's assistant come outside, and Snow White rushes over to ask how Jonathan is. Doc and the doctor's assistant exchange glances, making Snow White's stomach sink. Were they too late, she anxiously thinks? But then they look at her and smile. Why doesn't she ask him herself? Then Jonathan walks out, looking a little worse for wear, but thankfully very much alive. Everyone is relieved. Snow White rushes forward to hug him. He winces a little. He's still feeling a little tender, to which she hastily releases him. She says that she's happy he's okay. He says that he's happy he's okay too. It's then that Happy declares it's time to celebrate, and everyone jumps into it wholeheartedly as the dwarves and a few of the bandits play instruments while they all sing the silly song. Even Grumpy is reluctantly having a good time. Meanwhile, Jonathan is sitting down at a table as he's still recovering so he can't join the fun for too long. He's watching Snow White, smiling and singing and dancing with everyone. His mind flashes back to how she also smiled and sang and danced like that back when they were children, and a besotted expression appears on his face. It's then that the lead bandit sits down next to him and tells him that he should go dance with her. Jonathan tries to act nonchalant as he says he can't, that he's injured, and besides, she's the princess, and he's just a rogue now. The lead bandit retorts that didn't stop her from being friends with anyone and everyone when she was a child. Jonathan just says that it wouldn't make a difference anyway. She doesn't remember him, and he almost didn't remember her. The lead bandit looks at him, examining him, then pats him on the back, saying that it's better to take the leap before it's too late. Regret is more painful than heartbreak after all. Then he rejoins the merrymaking, and Jonathan looks back to Snow White, who's now taking a break. His attention then turns to Dopey, who's pulling at him to get off his seat and join in on the fun. Jonathan goes with a laugh that gets Snow White's attention. After a few moments of watching him have fun with Dopey, she begins to sing A Hand Holds a Hand, with Jonathan soon joining in, and the two slowly get closer and closer until they're standing close enough that if they leaned in they could kiss. However, they abruptly step back and just stand there awkwardly, looking anywhere but at each other. They then make stuttering excuses before going opposite ways to join the celebration again. At the end of the celebration, the bandits ask what Snow White's gonna do now. She says that she wants to take back the kingdom, but doesn't know if she's brave or strong enough to do so. Jonathan tells her that she already proved she was brave and strong enough when she went back to help the bandits even though she didn't have to. Snow White feels greatly encouraged by this, and the bandits tell her that they'll join her fight for the kingdom, and will go back first to spread the word of her survival and return to give the people hope. Snow White thanks them graciously, and the lead bandit says that they would have done the same thing for her parents, which she's genuinely touched by. Jonathan decides to go with the bandits as well, and Snow White makes him promise to take care, grabbing his hands with her own. He looks down at their intertwined hands and back up. He smiles gently at her and promises he'll make it back to her. The two groups part as Snow White will be staying another night with the dwarves, as they plan to have her wait for either Jonathan or one of the bandits to return and escort her safely to the kingdom. Unfortunately, none of them realize that a soldier had followed them back to the cottage, and he swiftly departs to report the news to the evil queen. We then jump over to the evil queen, who's sitting on her throne and glaring down at the soldiers in disappointment. She wonders aloud how a group of armed men could lose to one measly girl. The lead soldier tentatively reminds her that it wasn't just one girl, but the evil queen shouts for him to be silent. He shrinks in on himself. The evil queen continues to think aloud, wondering what kind of punishment would suit the gross incompetence of the soldiers before her. The soldiers all freeze in fear. But before she can make a decision, the soldier from the cottage returns, shouting that he knows where Snow White is. The evil queen sighs. Finally, some good news. The soldier tells her the location as well as the bandits' plans. The lead soldier then tentatively asks what their orders will be. The evil queen doesn't even have to think about it, because if she wanted something done, she would have to do it herself. She says she'll be the one to go after Snow White. Meanwhile, the soldiers will go capture the bandits and throw them into the dungeons for her to deal with later. The soldiers salute and hastily leave the room. Once they're gone, the evil queen gets up from the throne and walks into a side room with a winding staircase that leads her down into an underground lair filled with all sorts of vials and bottles, with a large cauldron in the middle and a thick tome sitting on a bookstand next to it. She flips through the tome until it lands on a poison called the Sleeping Death, and smiles evilly at the cure, believing Snow White will be buried alive before anyone can get the chance to kiss her. She sings a reprise of her villain song while preparing the poison and dipping an apple into it, then drinking a potion and turning into an old peddler woman, and finally rowing her way out of her lair with the reprise ending on an evil cackle. Meanwhile, Jonathan and the bandits arrive at the kingdom just as the sun rises and the downtrodden people begin to come out for the day's work. However, soldiers are also lying in wait for them, and they're swarmed the moment they pass through the gates. Jonathan and the bandits are all captured and tied up, but as they're taken away, they shout about Snow White's survival and how she's coming back to take the throne. This sends the people into a tizzy as they murmur and mutter amongst themselves, but no one really believes them and just think it's yet another failed attempt to rebel against the evil queen. Back at the cottage, the dwarves are leaving for work, but make Snow White promise to stay safe and let them know when she'll be heading off if Jonathan or one of the bandits comes back before they do. She promises and gives them a goodbye hug one by one, though Dopey comes back for another, and even Grumpy reluctantly accepts one from her. The dwarves leave and Snow White is left to her own devices, so she decides to tidy up a bit to keep herself occupied and prevent her mind from being filled with worry for Jonathan and the bandits. After some time, a peddler woman arrives. Snow White is surprised by her arrival and asks if she can help her. The peddler says she's been going around trying to sell her apples and asks if Snow White was willing to buy one. Snow White sadly refuses because she doesn't have any money. The peddler then squints at her before her eyes widen in recognition, and she asks if she's Princess Snow White. Snow White says she is, and the peddler is happy, saying she remembered when the kingdom was ruled by her kind and fair mother and father. Snow White is happy to hear that, though also sad, because of what has happened to the kingdom since their deaths. The peddler asks if Snow White will be taking back the throne, and Snow White says she will. The peddler is glad, and to honor her parents, would like to offer an apple as it would greatly please her to have her fruit be eaten by royalty once again. Snow White takes the offered apple with a smile, and the peddler asks her if she likes apples. Snow White says she loves them as the fruit reminds her of happier times and, she looks at the apple wistfully, of a promise once made upon it that she can no longer remember. The peddler hums thoughtfully and suggests that perhaps she take a bite, as it may help her remember that old promise. Snow White looks at the apple as if transfixed, and slowly brings it to her lips. The peddler watches in anticipation as she takes a bite. The spell immediately kicks in, and Snow White becomes disoriented and drops to her knees. The peddler cackles maniacally and lifts the spell to turn herself back to her original form. Snow White gaps in shock as the evil queen taunts her, saying that she'll die just like her father did, with only broken promises left as their legacy. Snow White glares defiantly at her. There was no threat from the south all those years ago, was there? The evil queen smirks. Sure there was. It was just her all along. Snow White says she won't get away with this, but the evil queen just laughs as she already has. Snow White then falls unconscious, but before she blacks out, her mind flashes back once again to the memory of the boy and the apple, but the face is a little clearer and less blurry than before. Just then, the dwarves return after the woodland creatures had gone to grab them when the exchange between Snow White and the peddler first began. They see the evil queen standing over Snow White's too still body. They stare in disbelief for a beat before charging at the evil queen, who simply laughs as she disappears in a plume of smoke. The dwarves gather around Snow White, with Doc checking her pulse and breathing. The other dwarves look at him in fearful anticipation. He sadly shakes his head, and they all bow their heads sadly in mourning. The animals gather around to mourn as well, while a bird swoops in and snatches Snow White's necklace from her neck before flying off into the distance. We then cut to Jonathan and the bandits, who are locked in the dungeon and chained up to a pillar. Jonathan is pulling on the chain, trying to remove it from the wall, but it refuses to budge. The bandits tell him to stop, that he's been at it for hours and nothing's changed. They're all gonna die down here from hunger or at the Queen's blade. Jonathan berates them for giving up so easily after a minor setback. They all look at him like he's crazy, because they're in a dungeon. This is more than a minor setback. Alright, it's a major setback, he corrects, but that still doesn't mean he's going to give up on escaping, because he's not going to give up on the future Snow White will bring. This starts to lift their spirits a little, and Jonathan continues, giving them a pep talk that urges them to keep fighting and not give up, because then that would mean the evil queen has won and Snow White is as good as gone. This gets the bandits to stand up and start yanking on their chains. It's then that the bird arrives and drops Snow White's necklace onto a surprised Jonathan's hand. The inscription, kind, brave, and true, glints in the torchlight, and he immediately knows something bad has happened. He and the bandits are reinvigorated in their attempts to escape, and after a few more hard pulls, their chains come loose from the pillar. Now it's time to return to Snow White. Jonathan and the bandits, led by the bird, soon arrive in a grove where the dwarves and other woodland creatures have gathered around Snow White's body as it's laid upon a bed of flowers. They gasp at the sight, and despair fills them, for they were too late and the princess is now dead. Jonathan kneels beside her, and the lead bandit steps up beside him. Jonathan croaks out that he was wrong. Regret was just as painful as heartbreak. The lead bandit grips his shoulder in a gesture of comfort before letting go and stepping back. Jonathan brushes a hand against Snow White's cold cheek with a heartbroken expression as he regrets never telling her who he really was and how he felt. Then he leans in to kiss her softly on the lips before slowly pulling away as tears stream down his face. There's a beat of silence as everyone bows their head to mourn the loss of a beautiful life, not noticing that Snow White's eyes were fluttering open. In Snow White's perspective, her mind once again pulls up the memory of the boy with the apple, except this time, the image is clear as it superimposes on present-day Jonathan's face, and fades away when she gasps awake. Everyone startles at the unexpected revival, but Snow White's attention is solely on Jonathan. "It's you," she says. "You're the boy with the apple. And you're the girl with the necklace," he says in return. The two then embrace each other for a kiss, while everyone celebrates because the princess is alive and has found true love. Snow White and Jonathan soon separate, and he holds up the necklace saying that he's sure she'll be needing this back now. She smiles and leans forward to let him put it back on her. Once the necklace is on, the celebration comes and the big question is asked. What do they do now? Everyone looks to Snow White as her expression becomes filled with determination. "We're going to take back the kingdom," she boldly declares. We then jump back to the kingdom where the people are going about their day in a depressing fashion. At the same time, we see Jonathan, the bandits, and the dwarves sneaking into the castle through the underground waterways and the Forgotten Garden. When we cut back to the people, we see movement by the gate has caught their attention, and they look over to see a red-cloaked figure walk through before stopping. They all stop what they're doing as they watch the figure slowly raise their hands up and pull the hood back to reveal it's Snow White. However, there's no reaction, no recognition from the people, as the last time they saw her, she was still a child, and by this point, they all either forgot her or believed her to be dead. Snow White takes a deep breath in before releasing it. She proclaims that she is Snow White and she is in fact alive, and here to take back the throne that rightfully belongs to her. Soldiers begin pouring out to surround her, but she refuses to back down. She apologizes for allowing the evil queen to treat the kingdom's people so poorly, and would understand if they hated her for essentially abandoning them. However, she appeals to the kindness she knows they all hold in their hearts, and vows to bring back the happy and peaceful times they once had when her father and mother ruled. Her speech is met with dead silence. For a few seconds, Snow White begins to believe that the people would rather wash their hands of her, so she puts on a brave face and walks forward unflinchingly as everyone stares at her. None of the soldiers attack her, and after a few paces, the child she saved from the bullying men rushes forward to join in her march. Then a few more paces, and the bullying men join her as well. Then the children she once played with who were all grown up now. Then the soldiers lower the weapons and march with her as well. By the time she's halfway to the castle, all the people have joined her march, and she smiles as she sings a reprise of Waiting on a Wish. By the time they reach the castle gates, the evil queen is waiting for them with more soldiers standing behind her. The evil queen is looking a little worse for wear. She's got a few wrinkles on her face now, but is still intimidatingly beautiful as she glares down at Snow White. Snow White demands the evil queen step down from the throne, but the evil queen laughs at her. She walks up to Snow White and then turns her attention to the people, giving the same rose and diamond lecture she gave Snow White. She turns back to Snow White and says that if she wants the throne, then she'll have to kill her for it. With a flick of her hand, a dagger appears. She then shoves the dagger into Snow White's hand and waits. Snow White looks down at the dagger and slowly raises her hand. The evil queen watches her unflinchingly. Snow White's hand begins to tremble, and after a beat, her hand drops. "No," Snow White says, "I refuse to kill you," and she tosses the dagger aside. The evil queen smirks as she already knew Snow White wouldn't have it in her to forcibly take back the throne. Snow White then tries to appeal to the evil queen, saying that everyone has kindness in her hearts, even her, because the evil queen could have killed her in all the years she was locked up in the castle, but she didn't. However, this sounds like a taunt to the evil queen, and it enrages her. "Are you calling me weak?" she demands. Snow White protests, saying she wasn't, but the evil queen refuses to listen anymore. She makes another dagger, intent on killing Snow White right then and there. However, an arrow strikes the dagger, knocking it out of her hand. Everyone looks up to see Jonathan at the castle gate, lowering the crossbow he just fired. He salutes Snow White with a cocky grin, and she smiles while shaking her head in fond exasperation. The evil queen scowls as Snow White once again demands she steps down. The evil queen looks around to see the people itching to mob her, her soldiers refusing to take up arms, and the dwarves, bandits, and Jonathan pointing their weapons at her from where they stand at the castle gates. The evil queen lets out a scream of rage as she unleashes a burst of power that knocks everyone down, before disappearing in a plume of smoke. Snow White quickly gets up to her feet and runs into the castle with everyone falling after her. The evil queen appears before her magic mirror and desperately asks, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all?" But the magic mirror's judgment doesn't change. While the evil queen is indeed fair, her beauty is only skin deep, the mirror says, as Snow White arrives and the evil queen's skin begins to age and wrinkle. The magic mirror continues its judgment, saying, "Snow White, who is beautiful both on the inside and out, will always be fairer than thee." The evil queen screams that the mirror is lying and smashes its surface with her fists, causing a magical backlash. Snow White watches in fascinated horror as the mirror's fragments hang in the air, and the evil queen's body solidifies into a gem that crumbles into jeweled fragments that are absorbed into the mirror. She slowly walks forward as the mirror repairs itself until there's only the undamaged surface that shows her reflection. Outside, the clouds part to reveal the sun as it shines down on the kingdom for the first time in 10 years. Snow White walks out into the main chamber, where everyone has gathered waiting to see who would come out with bated breath. The lead soldier walks forward and loudly proclaims, "All hail the Queen!" Everyone collectively shouts, "All hail the Queen!" And Snow White smiles as they bow to her, while Jonathan, the bandits, and the dwarves cheer and clap. We then cut to the kingdom now decorated for a celebration, with all the people, the bandits, and the dwarves involved in the merrymaking. Everyone is singing and dancing to a reprise of Good Things Grow, with Snow White and Jonathan in the center singing and dancing with each other. The song ends on a triumphant note, and the scene transitions to become a picture in the book from the beginning, with Jonathan and Snow White both narrating the end of the story with the classic, "And they live happily ever after, the end." Or something like that. Obviously this is not a perfect fix-it since I'm mostly using what the film already has, and I'm sure I made a bunch of plot holes on my attempt to fix the plot holes that were already there. But I hope that I at least managed to rework the story into something that's enjoyable and elevate it from a D to a B, or even a B+. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Reminder that this is just my take on how Disney's live-action Snow White could have gone, so whether you liked it or not, I don't mind either way, and would love to hear your thoughts in the comment section down below. Please feel free to like, subscribe, and comment which film you'd like me to try and rework into a better version of itself next. This is some random Neko, going off to sleep away my headache now. Don't forget to keep calm and just meow.